You know, as someone who owns an MPV, I have a soft spot for practical family cars. But let's be honest, they're not always the most exciting thing to look at. So the first time I saw the Toyota Rush, I did a double take. Here was a car that looked like an SUV, stood like an SUV, but had the practicality and proper layout of an MPV. And I thought to myself, now that's interesting. And now I'm finally excited to bring you this review. Quick heads up before we begin. This very Toyota Rush is for sale and the details are on the screen. If you're in the market for something like this or something else, the seller also has a few other vehicles available. So if you like what you see, don't be afraid to give them a call. Is it really the best of both worlds or just another confused crossover trying to do too much? My first impression of the Toyota Rush is that it's an aggressive looking vehicle. The muscular contours shaping the body panels make it look bold and rugged, as if they were jutting along the sides of the fenders. I'm not entirely sure if this design is for aerodynamic purposes or purely stylistic, but either way, it gives the Rush a distinctive edge. And that's especially worth pointing out when you consider that vehicles in the MPV segment usually feature soft flowing lines that make them appear more floaty, more like road-going jelly beans than something that could confidently tackle the outdoors. The Toyota Rush completely bucks that trend. In fact, if you keep looking lower down the car, you start to realize that the Toyota Rush isn't your typical MPV. With a ground clearance of around 220mm, that's the same as a Toyota Fortuner, mind you. It's as if this vehicle was purpose-built for African roads. Roads that can switch at a moment's notice from smooth tarmac to gravel, potholes, and everything in between. And personally, I really like that. More manufacturers should follow this trend. The versatility of an SUV combined with the practicality of an MPV, almost the best of both worlds. But more about that later on in the video. Now from the front, the Rush is a handsome looking car. It features 4 horizontal slats that make up the grille, giving it a bold face. To either side, the grille is flanked by headlamps that flow into the grille design, giving you the impression that they are one single continuous unit. It reminds me of the Hyundai Tucson, just well, a little less tastefully done on the Rush. Down the sides, the muscular theme continues, thanks to sculpted character lines and bold wheel arches. I do wish there was a running board because it can be a bit difficult getting in and out of the vehicle owing to its height. And here's something interesting. Unlike most traditional MPVs, the Rush has traditional swing-out doors at the rear instead of sliding ones. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing depends on your perspective. On one hand, traditional doors are simpler and more reliable and less likely to develop faults over time. Sliding doors, especially on older vehicles, tend to jam or fail if not well maintained. On the other hand, swing-out doors don't offer the same wide opening you get from sliding doors, which can be a bit of a drawback for an MPV. When you're loading big items, helping kids get in and out, or accessing the third row of seats, sliding doors just make life easier. Moving around back, the styling is more or less what you'd expect from a Toyota. It borrows cues from the RAV4 and second-generation Toyota Fortuner, which is no big surprise since they're all Toyotas. But the real standout feature is underneath the vehicle. A full-size spare tire. In a world where most manufacturers assume that we'd rather call roadside assistance than change a tire on our own, it's refreshing to see Toyota prioritize functionality over form. That said, this does come at a cost. It eats into the boot space. A better approach might have been an internal compartment with the option to store either a full-size spare tire or use the space for cargo. Now inside the Toyota Rush, you immediately get a sense that this was a car designed with family use in mind. And that's no accident. When the second generation Rush launched at the end of 2017, after nearly 11 years of development, practicality and versatility were clearly top priorities. You'll see that right away in the dash layout. The top section is hard plastic with leather-like texture, and the dashboard as a whole is upright and tall, almost MPV-like. And that's because underneath, the Rush is built on the Toyota Avanza MPV platform. That's right, it's a subcompact SUV in spirit, but a family haul at heart. What's strange though is the very prominent rectangular airbag cutout on the passenger side. Most manufacturers try to blend that into the dash, but here it's just there. Kind of speaks to the utilitarian no-nonsense design that Daihatsu is known for. At the center of the dash, you've got a gloss black panel with chrome outlining framing the infotainment and air vents. And honestly, those vents are sleek, one of my favorite design elements. Below all of that, you have your climate controls, also in a gloss black panel, and above those, a warning light and a slit for the passenger seat warning chime. I love how minimalist the climate controls are. They look very elegant. And at the belowest of the below part of the center of the dash, we have a flat rubberized section where you can put your phone and charge it too, because recessed into the lower section is a 12-volt, 120-watt cigarette-style charging socket. How very convenient. And then breaking up the black plastics, there's a cream leather style accent strip with the full stitch pattern. Starts all the way from the passenger side, dips into the center, and proceeds again on the driver's side, forming a somewhat V shape in the middle. This accent strip features on the door panels, both in the front and back, and it adds a nice touch of contrast and class to an otherwise modest interior. Up top, you've got two map lights and a little cubby to place your sunglasses. And I do have to say these map lights are standard and can be found in a variety of vehicles. However, I like how novel and simple they are. Oh, and before we forget to talk about the third row, there's actually enough space to carry two adults comfortably with storage pockets on either side, integrated speakers, and on the left, a cigarette-style charging socket. In fact, all the rows have a charging port, including the mid-row. Now, you can slide the mid-row forward or backward, but there's plenty of legroom and space for taller adults. The mid-row also gets nice big windows that roll down about 98% of the way. The door bins are spacious and offer plenty of usable storage. I should mention though, this particular car is heavily tinted from the front all the way to the back, so I couldn't get a clear sense of how much natural light actually enters the cabin, but I'm guessing it's quite a bit, even for the third row, owing to the large windows. The seats, a bit of a mixed bag. They've gone for a suede-like material in the center and a rugged cloth on the outside. Good for durability, but not the most comfortable or premium feeling. And I do worry about the suede holding up over time. Friction might wear that down quickly, which brings me to a couple of things I didn't like about this interior. The gear selector area unfortunately looks like it's been lifted from a budget Toyota. Hard plastics, uninspired design, especially disappointing when the upper dash has piano black and chrome that actually feels considered. And while we're on the subject of transmission, you could have optioned this car with a manual transmission. Why? Why would you do that? A tall, heavy, family-orientated MPV like subcompact SUV with 3 rows is not the place you want to be rowing gears. And the horizontal rear AC vents, they look like they've been taken straight out of 2002. For a car launched in 2017 and built over more than a decade of planning, this feels lazy. At the rear on the spoiler, the plastics that hold the third light in place are cheap-looking plastics that you'll see when you go to open the boot. But by far the worst offender, the gauge cluster. This right here should be where the driver feels connected, and instead we get a plain white and blue background that looks cheap. Now I know some of this might sound nitpicky, but these are everyday interaction points. They matter. Compare it to the 2009 Mazda MPV, where red needles and sporty dials remind you you're in something dynamic, or the 2008 Lexus IS220D, where the gauges do a little welcome dance and the font looks premium. These things make a difference. The Rush has a lot going on for it: practicality, space, ride height, but a little more thought into the details could have made a big difference. Here, it looks like they just gave up. Storage and family practicality, this is where the Rush really makes its case. Cup holders and bottle bins everywhere. I counted a combined 13 in total. 2 in each door, some for the third row passengers, a few more tucked into the center console. You can tell families were the target. The interior screams subcompact SUV for school runs, and that's probably how it was envisioned during development. With all that said, let's take a look at this car's practicality beyond all the sizable storage areas, which there are plenty of. The rear seat's back folds down and the whole seat itself folds forward, allowing entry into the third row of seats. I suspect this is so because this car uses traditional swing-out doors instead of sliding doors as mentioned earlier. There's also another advantage of this, and that is it creates space on the floor and you can fit about 2 crates sitting flat, one stacked on top of the other, and one standing upright. And I suppose you could place about 2 on the third row of seats when they're in their unfolded position. Because the third row of seats also folds down as they do in many vehicles, but unlike in most vehicles, these seats don't fold down flat, but instead the back part folds down and the whole seat folds forward, just like the ones in the front. And with the seats folded down, you can fit 3 crates sitting flat and stack another 3 on top. Now this creates a bit of a problem, because with all the seats folded down, you can't fit relatively long items. You have to use each compartment individually, which isn't a problem per se, more so an inconvenience if you have lots of separate items like boxes or groceries. But if you want to fit in furniture or something longer, you can fold the seats down, both the mid and back row seats. Now it's not perfect, it's compromised because it's not completely flat. However, with a bit of ingenuity, you can work with this space. Now that doesn't mean this car deserves a pass when it comes to all the problems we've discussed, from the cheap materials to the compromised space. These are all glaring issues that should have been rectified. Remember, the inception of this car happened more than a decade before its release, especially when you start to consider that most full-sized SUVs like the Honda CR-V have seats that fold all the way down and offer no compromise. But one word that you may have noticed me using throughout this video to describe this car may give us a clue as to why it is the way that it is, and that word is subcompact. Now that magic word explains quite a lot and immediately removes this car from competition like the Toyota RAV4, Nissan X-Trail or the Honda CR-V, which are compact SUVs. Instead, it places the Rush squarely in the sights of cars like the Honda Vezel or the Toyota CHR. And in that context, this car makes more sense. And arguably, it beats out those cars in terms of space and versatility thanks to elements such as its ground clearance. Another advantage to this is that it's also priced like a subcompact SUV, but with the space and arguably more versatility than a compact SUV. Prices for a Rush are relatively in the same range as the Honda Vezel, and prices for the CH are around the same ballpark. When you look at it like that, this car's a bargain. Now that raises an important question. Why aren't these cars more popular in Africa, especially here in Zimbabwe, when everything about them seems perfectly suited for our roads and lifestyle? Well, let's break that down. First, they were only sold in a handful of markets: Indonesia, the Philippines, Brunei, Bangladesh, the UAE, South Africa, Jamaica, New Caledonia, Colombia, Pakistan, Malaysia, and yes, even in Zimbabwe. You could buy one brand new here. Which brings us to the second point. If they are available brand new in Zimbabwe, why don't a lot of people know about them? I suspect a big part of this is down to Toyota's marketing, or lack thereof. Outside of a few independent reviews and one proper ad campaign, a far cry from the campaigning they did for the first generation of this car, like this one.
Oh, honey, mister.
There's barely been any effort to promote this car, and that's a real shame because I genuinely think a lot of people would have loved it if only they knew it existed. The third point builds on something I mentioned in my previous video about the Toyota Aqua. Most of the vehicles we see in Zimbabwe are ex-Japanese imports, and as I said earlier, Japan wasn't a key market for the Rush. Why not Japan? Isn't that Toyota's domestic market, you may be asking? And that takes us into point number 4, because to understand why Japan wasn't a focus, you need to understand the origin of this car. You probably heard me mention Daihatsu several times throughout this video, and that's very intentional. This car didn't start its life as a Toyota, it began its life as a Daihatsu Terios. Now, for those of you who may not know, Daihatsu is one of the oldest surviving internal combustion engine manufacturers in Japan. Historically, they specialized in three-wheelers and off-road vehicles. These days, they are best known for their K cars, mini trucks, vans, and other small format vehicles for the Japanese market. Since 2016, Daihatsu has been a wholly owned subsidiary of Toyota, and by 2021, they were responsible for about 4% of all the vehicles sold under the Toyota Group umbrella. Daihatsu's presence has been largely concentrated in Japan and Indonesia, while in Malaysia they operate under the Perodua brand, with full manufacturing, R&D, and distribution networks there. That's important because some of these Rushes aren't even badged as Toyotas. You're more likely to find them as a Daihatsu Terios or a Perodua Aruz, and even then, they are not exactly easy to come by. Now you're probably asking, if the Toyota Rush is this practical, spacious, high-riding, and the flaws are things most people could live with, then why isn't this car everywhere? Why aren't people lining up to buy one? No? You didn't ask about that? Well, too bad. Suck it up because we still have the driving section to cover. And my suspicion is that it all comes down to the driving experience. One of the first things I noticed when I got behind the wheel was the ride height. You sit up high. It's immediately confidence inspiring, especially here in Zimbabwe where the roads aren't exactly the smoothest. In fact, the first thing I did was drive down a road that was absolutely riddled with potholes, and I didn't flinch. That's the beauty of this car. You can tell that whether it was intentional or not, the Rush is ready for bad roads. That tall off-road orientated suspension setup soaks up the punishment really well. Now the suspension itself is springy, soft. It's got that bouncy feel you often get from a ladder frame SUV or pickups, which makes sense because underneath the Rush is rear wheel driven and borrows traits from that kind of setup. It's not perfect, of course. You do feel some floatiness. The car tends to rock side to side over uneven surfaces, and there's a bit of body roll in corners. But it's not harsh, it's not jarring, it's forgiving. The tires on this one, I'm not entirely sure if they're all-terrain. They look like road tires, but even as is, they're perfectly adequate. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of Rush owners ended up swapping them for chunkier rubber. There's space for that, and the car's whole attitude invites it. So yeah, rough roads, dust, gravel, occasional trip to the village, you'll be fine. In fact, this might be one of the few city SUVs that can actually handle that kind of daily punishment on our roads. Now let's talk about the engine, and this is where things start to fall apart a bit. The Toyota Rush uses a 1.5-litre 4-cylinder 2NR VE engine, making about 105 horsepower at 6,000 RPM. That sounds okay, but once you drive it, you realize very quickly this is not nearly enough for a vehicle of this size and shape. This engine transmission combo might be fine in a compact sedan, but in something that looks like a mini Fortuner, it's underwhelming. It's especially obvious when you're accelerating. Foot flat to the floor? Nothing, just noise and frustration. It's sluggish, lazy, and the 4-speed automatic gearbox doesn't help it at all. In fact, it makes things worse. The ratios are long, the shifts feel dated, and there's no sense of urgency. You can feel it in the way it drives. This car is built for start-stop city traffic in places like Jakarta or Mumbai, not for long open highways or hilly back roads like we have here in Zimbabwe. If you're a calm driver who's never in a rush, maybe it won't bother you, but me coming from something like a Mazda MPV or really anything with a bit more grunt, this feels like a downgrade. And what's frustrating is that the Rush looks the part. It looks bold, capable, like it could really go places, but the engine just doesn't live up to the promise the design makes. You get the form, but not the force. But that's not a huge deal breaker though. If you're someone who wants to save fuel and still wants a car that's big, feels substantial, towers virtually over everything in its class, has presence without destroying your fuel budget, then the Rush is for you. You don't have to sacrifice space or practicality just to sip a little less fuel. You just have to accept that performance isn't a part of the deal. Cabin noise is quite manageable. I wasn't training to hear myself or getting drowned out by the wind or tire noise. It's surprisingly composed in that regard, especially for something that rides this high and looks this rugged. But when it comes to overall refinement, it's not that the Rush feels cheap. In fact, it comes across as quite substantial. The materials, the layout, even the visibility, it all works well. What it does need is just a bit more polish. Small things. The way the suspension settles, the way the controls feel underhand, there's a sense that this car was built with durability and practicality front of mind, not necessarily smoothness or finesse. And to be fair, that might not matter for most people. If you're after a no-nonsense daily that feels sturdy and can handle bad roads without rattling itself apart, this does the job well. Visibility, the large windows, the high roofline, and those big flat side mirrors, it all combines to give you excellent outward visibility. You're not craning your neck trying to see out of tight junctions, and parking is made a lot easier because of it. Rear visibility? Still decent. The window isn't tiny like so many modern crossovers, and the rear view camera helps massively. You also get rear parking sensors as standard, which means reversing into tight spaces doesn't feel like guesswork. And again, the ground clearance helps. The extra ride height means you're not scared of curbs or uneven driveways. You're less worried about scraping things. It gives you a lot of confidence when navigating urban roads that aren't always in great shape, and especially when you're dealing with the kinds of potholes we get in Zimbabwe. Even if you're not used to driving bigger cars, the Rush has that easy, unintimidating vibe to it. So for newer drivers or anyone downsizing from a full-size SUV but still wanting the SUV feel, this car makes a solid case for itself. So, what's the verdict? Would I actually buy this car, or would I recommend someone else buy this car? Actually, I would. Despite the drawbacks, despite the sluggish acceleration and lack of polish in a few areas, the Toyota Rush just makes sense, especially here. For the roads we have, for the fuel prices we face, and for the type of versatility most people want but don't know how to find in one package, this thing nails it. It's high riding, tough looking, easy on fuel, and loaded with space. That alone puts it in a class of its own. There's honestly nothing else on our roads quite like it, so I'd find a way to live with all its flaws. Because when you look at the bigger picture, the Rush delivers on what really matters.